And now it's time for our next project presentation, and I invite Barbro Fröding from KTH to join me here. Hello, Barbro.
Thank you, Lukas.
Please.
Thanks. So the purpose of the ethics project is to help to identify and address a range of ethical aspects that attach when we develop and introduce a number of AI applications in Stockholm. So the project has a commitment to practical relevance and to academic output as well. But why ought we to care about the ethical aspects, you may wonder? Well, I'll give you two reasons here today. And the first reason has to do with the especially high ethical demands that are placed on the public sector when they introduce new technologies in the city. And that has to do with the fact that the public sector at all times needs to ensure equality and is always accountable to the public. It also has considerable power over the public. And these obligations, plus the differences in power, necessitates ethical choices. It requires high transparency, explainability, and a need to safeguard privacy. The second reason has to do with the purpose of the smart city. So in the case of Stockholm, smarter should be understood as improved citizen well-being. And for that to become an achievable goal, we need trust and we need long-term collaboration between the citizens and the city. So here we see some examples of the ethical aspects that may attach: privacy, trust and trustworthiness, transparency and explainability, justice and fairness, for example, ensuring equality and also avoiding to introduce or cement existing bias, responsibility, green sustainability and decision-making. Now, some of these are regulated in the law. Consider, for example, how the GDPR is developed to protect privacy. Also, issues attaching to responsibility and accountability are regulated in the law. But there are also other ethical issues here on this list, which are not explicitly regulated, but nonetheless still need addressing. So the ethics project can be split into two parts. One consists of a series of interviews that then became a report, and the other part consists of a series of ethics counselings for the projects in the lab. So let's take a closer look. Starting with the interviews. So we conducted 6 interviews. 3 women and 3 men, all working in relevant projects in the city, were interviewed. And they were asked to reflect broadly on the ethical issues that attach to their work in light of their professional experience. So we asked them 19 questions, and then that was organized into 9 different themes. And here we see 4 examples of those themes that we can also find in the report. So the first theme was when they were asked which ethical challenges they had come across and what strategies they had deployed to deal with them. The second theme is what type of support they had in that work and what they would have liked to have. Third theme, responsibility issues. And fourthly, communication with stakeholders. Sorry, did I switch there? Yes, okay. So a number of insights came out of the interviews and the report writing, and here are some examples. So firstly, an insight is that there is a need to discuss the distinction between the law and ethics and to provide reasons for why we sometimes need to do more than the law specifically requires us to do. Another insight is that there is a need for more support with regards to the ethical work and more structure. Yet another insight that we can be inspired by good practice and research ethics, even though this is not research projects. The last 2 bullet points, they concern insights regarding communication. There is a need for a broader, more transparent communication which doesn't only concern the technology or the final result of a project, but rather to strive for dialogue and involvement and perhaps share reflections on ethical aspects in the project. If you've applied for permits, yes or no, and what that entailed, and the overarching purpose and the practical relevance of the project you carry out. The report also contains recommendations, and here we see some examples of suggestions for what a structure for the ethical work could be. So we suggest maybe to form an ethics council, to compose an ethical policy which is contained in one document, also to offer ethics counseling for the relevant projects, to do ad hoc training in form of workshops, or project-specific checklists, and also regular exchanges between the projects where they can discuss their experiences. And it's arguably quite a useful combination to strive for both the general guidelines and more applied to contextualize what these general guidelines should mean in a specific project. So the other part of the ethics project concerned ethics counseling. Now, an ethics counseling is a discussion-based session where we help the researchers to identify and address the ethical issues that pertain to their projects. And the reason why it's useful is because it helps to contextualize the otherwise pretty abstract ethical issues and to understand what that means in this specific project. And the session also helps to discuss the bigger picture. How does my project fit in? What's the potential for positive contributions? And also, what is the risk for negative fallouts from my project? Does my project stand to somehow contribute to the undermining of transparency and trust, or the entrenching or introduction of bias? So how is it done then? Well, it's pretty straightforward, I think. First, the principal investigators, they share the relevant information with us. Then we have an online session, which of course could also be live. And then a few days after, we write up an ethics assessment, and this contains the main recommendations from the session and also discussions surrounding good practice. And of course, me and my colleagues were available for further advice if need be for the project. So the results then. Well, first of all, it offers concrete advice, for example, whether or not one ought to apply for an ethics permit. It also increases the awareness amongst the researchers of the ethical aspects that are relevant in their projects, knowledge which could also carry through to other projects. And it emphasizes the need for an ongoing reflection. So it's not the case that this is a one-off session, right? The recommendation is, of course, to have a living discussion on the ethics in your project. An aspirational goal is to create a repository containing ethics applications and ethics assessment and best practice to advise other projects in the lab. So at the beginning, I said we had a commitment in the ethics project both to forward the practical relevancy and also the academic output. So I'm pleased to introduce here my colleague Fábio Duarte and I have recently written an article which is forthcoming in this journal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbro.
Thank you. May I go and
please,
take a
yeah,
seat?
yes,
Thank
do.
you.
You know the drill. That's great. And I ask Anna Hörlén from the city of Stockholm to enter, together with Fábio Duarte. Please join the panel. So, thank you, Barbro. I will start by asking you a question. I mean, this was, we understood that it's not easy to think of all the things that you need to think of to be ethically good. But what do you think are the biggest challenges in projects like this to work with ethical aspects?
Well, I think it's very helpful to have a concrete structure for the work so that you don't become overly reliant on individuals who, although very competent, that becomes a bit ad hoc. So a general structure, I think, for the work. And I think another challenge, in addition to lack of structure, is that it's sometimes quite challenging, perhaps, to distinguish between the legal aspects and the ethical aspects. And then also, once you realize what the ethical aspects are, to make them applicable in your project, right? To contextualize what can be rather abstract and what that means for you.
Yeah. And so what could the city then do to achieve a more standardized way of working with ethics?
Well, we have some recommendations in our report, or some suggestions, if you will,
Yeah.
and that is to combine sort of more general guidelines and maybe an ethics council and the policy with more practical, contextualized support for the projects to interpret the general and understand what that actually means in their projects. So I think you need both those aspects.
Yeah. Okay. And Anna, do you think is this something that we are going to do?
Of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm
No,
relieved.
but the ethical aspects and the ethical question is really important when we have projects like this and when we run projects like this. And me and Barbro had a lot of conversation and cooperation that I hope we will continue. But we have the AI plan that we implemented last year and that we are looking over every year. So we have the possibilities to include ethical aspects, and these are really also important in the AI plan. And also, as Barbro said, the differences between the legal and the ethical aspects, we also need to look more in depth into that, but also have processes and guidelines, etc., for the ethical aspects in these kind of projects.
Yeah, and then, to my experience, it's also very interesting to work or to discuss ethics, because the borderline between legal aspects and ethics are not very clear at the moment. So it's really, an adventure in a way. It doesn't sound like it, but it is. Yeah. So, and I would like to ask you, Fábio, about the publication that Barbro showed us. Can you elaborate a little bit on it?
Yes. So the publication, it's around big data, small data, and no data. So big data, we all here have listened about, and we worked about that. However, there are some issues in the world that requires small data. So medicine, for instance, they are fighting with big data methodology applied to what is intrinsically a small data problem, and they are finding several problems using big data methodology with small data. So first, we argue that in some cases, and the city is one example, sometimes we need to recognize the value of small data. However, there is the third part, which is no data. No data is where we try to save privacy by not giving out data. But if we don't have data, it might lead us to autocracy. So how we balance it? Big data, small data, and no data is basically the topic of this paper.
To get the idea of enough data.
Yeah,
in a way.
to get the idea of enough data, yeah.
And then that would be very important, I think, for us, because there are two trends. One is just to share everything, and the other way around would be to be very strict.
Exactly.
So, and what are you advertising then?
Yeah, what we are advocating for is the enough data. So how can we have data to review aspects of the city that we cannot know without dealing with this data, but without revealing too much about the people who are behind this data? There is no raw data, right? All data is categorical. There is no 1, 2, 3. Each 1, 2, 3 is a categorical data in itself. So how we can use data to review the city without revealing the people behind this data?
Yeah. Good. I will read it. I haven't. Okay. So, and what could the next steps be then if we continue this project, the ethics project in the lab?
Well, I'm excited to do more of the ethics counseling, but also to follow the projects now that they're up and running and continue the discussion, which needs to be a living discussion, right? Like I mentioned, because things can change. You have unexpected findings, and things develop, right? So it's, for me, it's been a great learning process, and I enjoy it.